Good morning again to everybody, and for those that have just joined us. My name is Sarah Scarth, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this session this morning. Our panelists are all women, a panel team. First of all, I'd like to introduce Noxolo Hlongwane. For those of you who don't know Nox, she is the head of the Philanthropy Office at Nedbank Private Wealth, who provide a range of specialist advice and services to individuals, families, private and corporate foundations, as well as to not-for-profit organizations to ensure their sustainable and impactful giving. For those of you who know Nox, she is absolutely passionate about sustainable economic and social development and the strategic role that private philanthropy can play. So thanks, Nox, for being with us this morning. We then have joining us from Johannesburg, based in Johannesburg, Mamo Mohapi. She's the program officer at the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. Mamo is responsible for managing the expansion of the foundation's community philanthropy and civic space programming in Africa. And in her early years at the foundation, she focused on the development of community philanthropy in South Africa. But throughout her career, she's gained extensive experience in working in the philanthropy sector and has managed several portfolios on resourcing the not-for-profit and philanthropy sectors. Next, I welcome Louise Driver. Louise is the Executive Director for the Independent Philanthropy Association of South Africa, which is a membership-based philanthropy forum which promotes and advances and supports philanthropy in South Africa. Prior to joining IPASA, Louise was CEO of the Children's Hospital Trust, and prior to that she also worked for the Catholic Welfare and Development, and she's also was head of Greater Capital. So she's had both experience in the not-for-profit sector as well as in corporate and now in private philanthropy. And finally, I'm very pleased to have with us Keri-Leigh Paschal. She's the Executive Trustee and Co-founder of Nation Builder, which is part of the Mergon Group initiative, which she joined in 2011, and the Nation Builder Trust was officially launched in 2012. Keri regularly addresses business leaders and undertakes media engagements as she works towards the goal of bringing businesses, communities, and civil society and government together to build the nation and secure a prosperous future for all South Africans. And she's worked in a wide range of functions, both locally and internationally, and certainly is a very valued member of this panel. So thank you to everybody for being part of us, joining us today. So I'd like to start by asking my first question to Noxolo and Keri-Leigh. And, you know, we know, all of us, that COVID has seriously weakened our already fragile economy. And with unemployment rates rising, businesses under pressure, I mean, all of us, I think on our daily, when we do get out, are seeing businesses closing and knowing that cutbacks are now a reality. So as the majority of businesses really fight for their survival, I'd like each of you to ask if you can share with us, how do you expect this is going to impact on corporate giving over the next year to 2 years? And in particular, what changes are you anticipating in how corporate South Africa is likely to be engaging with the social impact or not-for-profit sector going forward? Nox, can I ask you to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Without a doubt, Sarah, there is an expected impact over the next 2 years or even beyond as the economy and business recovers in terms of how corporates participate and provide support to the not-for-profit sector. Corporate budgets for social investment will definitely be impacted. These are mostly directly linked to business performance and profits. With profits under pressure, there's likely to be less resources allocated to social investment. And so that's just a reality that we can't really shy away from. As corporates look to optimize their own operations, as you highlighted, everyone is struggling for survival, essentially, really tightening things all around. Most corporates have instituted a headcount freeze when it comes to recruitment and are looking for efficiencies and identifying which operational or sales-related initiatives really give the most return. The same approach is likely to extend to the social partners of corporates and business. Corporates are unlikely to bring on new partners from a CSI perspective at this stage, but rather maintain existing partners and maintain support to existing partners. And we've seen this throughout the pandemic, where a lot of funders really tried to support their current base of partners as much as they can, as opposed to overextending themselves to new partners. And as budgets remain tight, with an even greater focus on impact and scalability. So really trying to see where can we get the most bang for our investment. And so this is where technology can really be instrumental for the nonprofit sector. When we're talking scale, how do we ensure that our services really touch a lot more beneficiaries than we've seen in the past? And so going forward, we all have to think innovation and technology. It does provide a more cost-efficient way of touching beneficiaries, as I've mentioned, and also anticipating an even stronger emphasis on partnerships and collaboration, Sarah. How do we find ways of deliberately working closely together, both as funders as well as nonprofits and beneficiary organizations that we partner with? So as the purse gets tighter and tighter over the next few months, I anticipate on my side that there definitely will be less money to go around, which really does create a stronger and compelling case for more collaboration from both funders as well as nonprofits. So this is the time for organizations to really tag team and work together and present themselves collectively when approaching corporate funders.
Thanks, Nox. Keri, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, so very similar to Nox. For those of you that don't know, Nation Builder has communities in Gauteng, Western Cape and KZN of corporates that do corporate social investment, and we have about 200 different entities that are part of our community. And it was interesting to see as COVID hit, everybody was mobilizing, looking at their budgets, seeing how do you distribute your budgets effectively to do relief work, but at the same time look at the sustainability of the organizations that you're currently partnering with. And there were some really beautiful moments where the corporates and not-for-profits, we also have a not-for-profit community that meets, and they were meeting with one another to share lessons, learn lessons from one another. And there was probably more collaboration and peer learning than I've ever seen before, and people coming together to find solutions in the thick of COVID. But as we're starting to see, we're like in month 5 almost of the pandemic, and we're starting to see the knock-on effect from the economy. And so within the last month, I've had numerous people contacting me to tell me that their CSI departments have been made redundant. So because we're a community, a lot of people contact us to see if there are other opportunities out there, or if we know of anyone that's looking to recruit, which at the moment there's very few things out there outside of the not-for-profit sector, because there's a lot of need at the moment in the not-for-profit sector. But we are seeing huge cutbacks from corporate social investment. We are seeing a lot of job losses in the sector, and that speaks directly to the fact that those departments don't have the resources to distribute anymore, and therefore those positions have become redundant. So 100% aligned with Nox, seeing the knock-on effects only starting to take place now, and it's going to continue to increase for the next couple of months. So definitely a decrease in funding. Some of the conversations that we've been involved with, we've seen a lot of the corporate conversations swinging toward, well, our resourcing has been cut. If it hasn't been cut substantially, it's definitely been cut in most areas. And so they are saying, how do we make sure that we maximize our impact? So your impact measurements and your impact management is starting to become incredibly important. And at the moment, people are a little bit more relaxed around it because we're still in the middle of COVID and everybody's still sort of in a bit of crisis mode, trying to figure things out and just plug holes where there are holes at the moment. But going forward, everybody's predicting a much bigger emphasis and focus on impact reporting, and that people are going to be making a lot of their decisions very strongly based on the kind of data that we're getting out of your impact reports. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is that sustainability, the conversation around sustainability has been going on for years. And we've been definitely pushing from the corporate social investment side, we've been pushing to encourage not-for-profits to be self-generating income. So we've really tried to push that narrative a lot around how to become a sustainable organization. And what we've seen in COVID is quite interesting, that the organizations that had a huge amount of budget that was from self-generated income actually suffered the biggest impact immediately, because their income streams are 100% dried up when it came to their own self-generated income streams because of the sort of lockdown level 5. Whereas the people that had a diversified portfolio of self-generated, international, local, sort of, sort of crowdsourced individual funding, they had a lot more stability within their sustainability. So whereas we're also having a lot of conversations within the corporate social investment arena around sustainability, and when we are looking at organizations to partner with, how do we partner with organizations that are sustainable but with a slightly different lens on sustainability? Almost going back to the diversified income streams is the way forward for sustainability, rather than pushing the very self-generated income narrative. So those are really the three main points.
Thanks, Keri. And Nox, before I move on to the next question, just to come back to the point you said about collaboration and partnerships, just wanted to dig a little bit more into that, because just your sense of am I right in hearing you that instead of, that it's that impact again, that like, let's have how do we scale, how do we reach the greatest number, and that by organizations coming together and demonstrating to funders and corporates in particular how they're working together, is that what you're encouraging our audience to be doing more of?
Yes, definitely, Sarah. And I think really, how do you find organizations that complement the services that you provide, so that we are approaching funders with really a solution that addresses the bulk of the value chain of whatever area that we work in. If we use education as an example, if one organization provides support to secondary school learners who at a particular grade, but who are the organizations and partners that work in the same space that provide support, similar support or supplementary support to other grades that complement that? And I think that makes for a more compelling case, because you're not just coming to say, I work with grades 10 to 12, but you're saying, here's a collective of organizations that really support young people, learners in maths and science, really from grade 5 all the way to grade 12. And therefore, it creates a more compelling story, because from a funder perspective, it gives the assurance that the same cohorts that I'm supporting really is supported throughout. It's not just for 2 grades and then we drop them. So really, it really is up to organizations at this point to find who's working in the same space as you, who's providing complementary services that you support, and how do we then put together a collective proposal, really, as we approach funders, to say, this is what we can do, and this is the impact that we can then achieve collectively.
Yeah, thanks Nox, for expanding on that a bit more. And I think, the title is Business as Usual or a New Paradigm, and I think you've just affirmed it isn't business as usual. If you've been thinking about collaboration or partnerships, but it's, as we all know, it's a tricky and difficult space to go into. If this is a big recommendation, you just don't have the luxury anymore to ignore it. You have to now get your head around it and start to think about operating a different way. So thank you for affirming that. So let's move on now from sort of the focus on corporates and look more at foundations, and in particular private foundations. So my next question to Louise and Mamo. So, you know, we know that many foundations responded very quickly to the crisis, you know, changing their funding requirements, or, adding more, to a large extent, adding more money into the pot, dipping into their reserves, and certainly to address the immediate food insecurity crisis. But in particular, I think now that has happened, what changes do you expect to see going forward? And how do you think that funders are going to engage and support the social impact sector in South Africa as a result of kind of what they've had to do in response to COVID, both, kind of maybe a dipping into their reserves, but also their endowments maybe have been affected as well. What's your sense of that? Mamo, if I can ask you to start.
Sure, thank you, Sarah, and hello, everyone. I think what we've seen in the last couple of months has certainly presented a huge challenge for many of the philanthropy organizations. In a sense that in as much as there was greater need for resources, as you said, Sarah, a lot of the foundations were hit hard in terms of their investments and their endowments. And what that has encouraged a lot of foundations and philanthropy organizations to do is to look more towards supporting existing partners. And so what we've seen is that even with a lot of the navigating that foundations have done in unlocking additional resources, a lot of that has been channeled into making sure that existing partners are able to continue to do the work that they do. But in addition to that, be able to respond to the pandemic as it presented itself at that moment. And so I think what we will start seeing in the future a lot more actually is a lot of the foundations kind of cementing a lot more the relationships that they currently have with existing partners, even as they navigate their own resourcing in terms of funding and investment. And so I think it's going to really build a lot of the trust that in many ways has been eroded in the nonprofit sector. And I think one of the things that we've also seen having to deal with the pandemic is that we needed to have institutions that were strong enough to be able to respond to the pandemic. We needed to have organizations that could work around the money that they have to be able to respond rapidly and quickly to some of the issues that came up. And so what that's going to do going forward is that it's going to challenge a lot of the foundations to start being a little bit more flexible. And I think a lot of that has happened, but it has happened in response to a crisis. So it wasn't always a kind of a practice that was adopted throughout. So what we're going to see is that this will become a lot more practice, less stringent requirements, much more flexible support, much more flexibility to move within the budgets that exist in terms of the funding. I think the third part that we've seen coming out of the crisis is that we needed to have organizations that were as closely connected to the communities as possible, because as the crisis was unfolding, it became clear that the only way to be able to support any kind of response is to have organizations that are as closely linked to communities as possible, being the ones that are leading the response. And I think the challenge with philanthropy over the years has been that because of the kinds of processes we have in place, it's often challenging to fund smaller, much more flexible, much more nimble types of organizations that are as closely connected to communities as possible. And I think the pandemic has presented that opportunity because people have had to work within that system to make sure that resources get as close to the communities as possible. And so I think going forward, there's going to be a much more bigger appetite to start focusing on funding as close to communities as possible. I think the last element that I thought would actually come into the picture now is a lot more focus on making sure that organizations have the kind of technology that they will need to pivot them into whatever post-COVID looks like. And I think, foundations have been really interested in making sure that as organizations are navigating this space, they have the resources they need to be able to do that. And technology is going to play quite a big part in that. So I think investing in much more techno-savvy ways of working is something that foundations will start looking at a little bit more going forward.
So kind of bridging that gap between, we want to work with organizations that are on the front line, but how do we help you be as effective and efficient as possible by embracing tech, and what role do we play in helping you get there?
Absolutely.
Oh, that's really exciting. Louise, what's your perspective? I mean, Mamo's with one very large private foundation that works across multiple different countries. You're working closely with South African foundations. What's your perspective?
Thanks, Sarah. I think, I share quite a bit of what Mamo said. I just want to say that just in my start, that the foundations who form part of IPASA, their response to COVID was incredible. I mean, they invested, they substantially increased their investments. Most of them did it very quickly. They repurposed existing grants. They gave out emergency funding. They listened to their beneficiaries and trusted them to do what they thought best was in terms of their COVID response in their communities. And the flexibility and the rapidity at how they responded was incredible. And now that, we're, as you say, almost 5 months in, they've had a chance to reflect on what the response was. And definitely the one lesson coming out of it is that they need to work more closely with their beneficiaries, and there needs to be that element of trust. And there has been for a long time a breakdown in trust between the funders and the nonprofit sector or the beneficiaries, and how during this period be that element in order to allow the organizations on the front line to respond as they thought would be best. There was also quite a bit of work on capacity building of beneficiaries in terms of coaching, one-on-one check-in calls, skills training for those people who never worked digitally before and suddenly had to have, work on laptops or work on all these different platforms. So there was also this recognition of this opportunity to engage with beneficiaries beyond just their project, the project implementation, but also in terms of supporting the organizational development and the organizational capacity. There's also been a reflection on the financial systems, as you say, well, not the finances of these foundations. So as you know, most of our members are have large endowments, but they've had to really dip deeply into these endowments. And there is a concern about how this is going to affect in 2021, 22, etc. So there is an appetite now for different type of financing models and different ways of supporting projects. The Oppenheimer Generations philanthropies, they did a whole loan scheme for small businesses. Ford Foundation did something really radical and actually took out debt to finance all their different beneficiaries. So there's been a more appetite for non-traditional financing and funding, which I think is great in terms of the future, because I don't believe that the traditional funding is sufficient to meet all the needs in our community. And lastly, I think it really brought up the need for fundraising. So there was a funding. There was a lot of research, so many COVID surveys and research studies, which where a lot of lessons learned and recommendations were made. And I think that has helped inform funders as to both how to respond to a crisis, but also how to build back better. So not only do funders want to go back to the new norm, if you can call it a norm, but they want to say, okay, everything's been broken down with the COVID crisis. How are we going to not invest in this to not only build it back, but build it back better? And looking at, fundamental issues, systems change, to really make the sectors they invest in, sustainable.
Great. Thanks, Louise and Mamo. So if we, to you, Nox and Keri, if we, the pandemic has really shown up deep cracks in our society that, for too long we've just recognized we're just trying to paste over. And with these now sort of really laid bare, and once businesses start moving out, recognizing that it's going to be a really tough time over the next, 12 to 24 months and probably even longer. How do you see businesses' participation and investment in the social impact sector, and then potentially seeing it through a different lens? And kind of, if we think about, what has motivated and driven their decisions around how to get involved, whereas what it might look like in the future, and therefore how should our audience be preparing for those potential changes? Keri, do you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. So, I think the way forward is going to be really interesting because your businesses are going to be focusing on getting themselves back on their feet too. So everybody's going to be going into a recovery phase, which is something that is quite uncharted for our generation. I think generations before us have seen this before, but for us this is new. But one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is the business community is going to need to become a lot more in touch with what's happening on the ground within our country. And not only from a development perspective, but also from a business imperative perspective. So the current products that are on offer are going to need to shift because people don't have incredible disposable income. They're also the types of products that people have been buying, say if you're thinking about insurance, and people are looking for ways to cut costs. So the corporates and the businesses are going to need to start having conversations with the people on the ground at grassroots level, trying to understand what are the actual needs out there and where do the opportunities lie, one from a business perspective, and then in the reverse, I think the not-for-profit community gets to speak a lot more into the way that business is structuring themselves, which means that business will also start thinking a lot more around the sustainability aspects of will these interventions or will the things that we are busy implementing, not only from a business perspective, but from a social perspective, have longevity. So we see these two sectors coming together a lot more going forward. And I think the more that they interact with one another, the stronger the approach is going to be. But the second thing is, and it's something that we've noticed, some of the cracks that we've seen within, everything rings. One of the cracks that we've seen coming out in COVID is the lack of coordination. Coordination amongst the not-for-profit sector, coordination amongst the donor community, coordination between government and business and civil society. But there have been some really beautiful developments that have started happening. I know within our Nation Builder community, we've actually started working very closely with the Department of Social Development, and that's been incredible, seeing the amount of new opportunities to collaborate, to work together, to start looking at coordination exercises. I mean, Chikalulu is busy looking at the moment at trying to map out what's happening with the COVID responses. There's multiple different groups around the country that we're in contact with that are busy doing mapping exercises, trying to understand what the different not-for-profit organizations are busy with. Your funder community is trying to understand who's funding what, very similarly to what Nox spoke about earlier, so that they can actually start working together to fund pipelines rather than just individual organizations. So I think the collaboration, the coordination is going to be key, and we're going to see these sectors pulling much closer together, which I think is actually a positive out of COVID, because we've been very siloed in our approach over the last many years, and sort of touch base with one another when necessary. But this is really forcing us, between government, civil society and business, to collectively find solutions, and that's quite exciting.
Thanks, Keri. Nox, what's your perspective? There we go. What's your perspective on how you see the lens through which you expect corporate funders in particular to be looking at their relationship with the not-for-profit sector going forward? And I think really interesting what Keri was saying about the government's role. What's your perspective on how that's likely to change?
Definitely aligned with what Keri has shared around the role of business going forward, and how business is going to start perceiving their own role when it comes to social issues and social challenges. The deep-rooted issues of the persistent inequality in a society can no longer be ignored. It's just not sustainable. And I think that the current pandemic has really proven that it impacts and it affects all, including threatening the sustainability of business. I do expect corporate to continue to providing grants to the non-profit sector, but really I expect and anticipate a big shift towards a greater focus in terms of how business utilizes their skills, expertise, competencies, IP, and other infrastructure and resources such as technology to contribute to solving for social challenges and social issues. So I think business is going to really start appreciating themselves as a core role player as opposed to just a funder when it comes to solving social challenges. And I think this always takes me back to an article I read almost 10 years ago, which was written by McKinsey in the McKinsey Quarterly Review. And really it spoke about going forward how the business of business is going to be to solve for social challenges. And I think, as Keri mentioned, that we are going to see a closing of the gap or narrowing of the gap between corporate, business, and community. So I think business will definitely move towards getting closer aligned and in touch with what is happening in communities. And so it's a participation that extends beyond CSI departments, but really to mainstream business, to products and services. Solving for social is going to be an imperative, as Keri has mentioned. It's just not a by the way or an add-on. And Keri mentioned to products. If we look at financial services providers as an example, how do banks and other financial providers deliberately create opportunities to provide for low-cost housing segments, as an example, that were previously deemed to be high risk and that no one wanted to touch, which really talks to the housing challenges. And how do providers in financial services ensure their products are geared towards wider financial inclusion? So I think as business really looks to build back better, to steal from Louise, it is around redefining our purposes as well as a business. And I think it talks to sustainability of business, and it talks to greater alignment with the SDGs as a measure of success for business on the main part. And what does this mean for nonprofits? How do they prepare for themselves for these big changes? And I think organizations really need to start thinking out the box. We really need to start thinking of alternative and different models of engaging and different models, disruptive models of participating in this space. It's definitely not going to be continuing as per normal. We're all being forced to sharpen our craft That's without a doubt, and really become even more targeted. So organizations need to take time to really understand their current corporate partners, take time to really understand their pain points and their pressure points, and how do you then respond to these and better respond to these. We know that building the economy is top priority at the moment, but alongside that is the issue of the high youth unemployment and unemployment in general, and the issue of skills, which is a burning platform for corporates. And really, when we get to understand what are the pain points of corporates, then we can better align ourselves with what corporate needs to respond to, and what they are desperate to respond to. And it is around building and exploring relationships outside of the CSI department, because a lot of these initiatives are going to be driven from outside of CSI departments, but within the wider business, as we've mentioned. You look at cause-related marketing. If we look at the YES program, which was rolled over 2 years ago, Nedbank was a huge participant and player in that, supporting over 3,500 young people. But it was an initiative that was not driven out of the CSI department. So how does the nonprofit sector really extend their relationships and really understand where opportunities are going to be coming from? And it talks to really getting to know your stakeholders and your partners, and taking time to really strengthen those relationships, invest in those relationships. And as I mentioned, we definitely need to move towards new, innovative and disruptive models, as opposed to really trying to leverage off existing models. And as I mentioned, I think business is really going to start looking at themselves as a core role player when it comes to social challenges, and how can they use their own internal competencies and infrastructure to play a more meaningful role over and above just providing grants.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Nox. And before we move on, I just want to ask us to, just stay on this a bit more, because it feels like what you're all saying is the narrative is going to be different now, and it's how are you placing yourself in to be heard, and so yes, grants will continue to be given, but if that's the only thing you're relying on, and the only way that you're going to be engaging with funders, you're not seeing what's coming over the horizon. And so my next question is, for organizations that are larger, maybe more better resourced, have very strong leadership, we know there's a power dynamics is always at play. It feels like even more important that our sector organizes itself to ensure that smaller groups are there's a collective that's able to speak to potential partners, and that it really is a partnership discussion as opposed to just going and looking for that check. It feels like if there's a strong message that I'm hearing from everybody is that the way you interact with foundations or with corporate partners has to change. You have to see it more than just how do I fill in that grant proposal. Would you agree with that?
From my side, definitely, Sarah. And I think, as I mentioned, that for me, business is really going to get in touch with what is our purpose more than ever before. And I think that's what their customers are also demanding of business that they support. And I think likewise for nonprofits, the competing for resources is really not going to take us forward. It is around, as you highlighted, how do the well-resourced organizations that have the infrastructure, that have the resources, how do they then work alongside the smaller organizations and the community-based organizations to make sure that they don't get left behind? Because really, some of the community-based organizations work in such remote areas and spaces, providing such amazing work and much needed work that some of our big organizations, some of them don't really have an interest in going to some of those remote areas. So how do organizations be deliberate about partnerships and deliberate about bringing other organizations along the journey and ensuring that they don't get left behind? I mean, especially when we talk of technology. I mean, within our business, we're in the middle of a 3-year plan cycle now. And whatever initiative you're putting forward, if it doesn't have technology alongside it, you may as well just stop in your tracks, essentially, because that's where the world is moving. How do we digitize? How do we get more efficiencies? And how do we touch more people? And I think it needs to be the same sort of tune for the nonprofit sector to say, it is a more cost-efficient way of delivering our services and touching more beneficiaries. But how do we then ensure that the smaller organizations don't get left behind? And what is our responsibility as the well-established organizations that has access to more resources to bring along those organizations?
Great, thanks. Keri, anything more to add on that?
Yes. So what I wanted to say to your comment around partnership, I think it has been really interesting, probably is the best word, to see how COVID has shifted something in some of the conversations where historically the businesses were sitting, or the donor community, because we don't only deal with corporates, but the donor community was sitting in a position of power, and they don't always want to be in that position of power, but by virtue of the makeup, they sit with the power. And therefore, often the conversation used to be, not-for-profits, this is sort of the way that we think that you should go, or you should do more of this, you should do more of that. And when COVID hit, it was really interesting to see that the conversation almost shifted, where the people on the ground, the not-for-profits on the ground, were the only ones that could actually give really good insights into what was needed in the season that we were facing. And suddenly there was this great amplification of the not-for-profit voice, and it could speak into the donor community going, this is what we need, this is how you can support us, this is the best way forward. And it was actually a really beautiful moment of the playing field starting to be leveled, and that partnership in the truest sense of the word starting to form, because it's normally been a bit of an unequal partnership. Some people have managed to get it right, but it's been really nice to see that solidify. And then the second thing, we're actually in a very interesting discussion the other day, and it had to do with a stimulus package that's being looked at, but there was a lot of conversation specifically with bigger not-for-profits, and they were talking about, well, what if we had some kind of incentives that were built into stimulus packages or relationships with the donor community, where there's a need for the bigger organizations to actually partner with the smaller organizations that might be in more rural areas, or are in the cities or in urban areas, but are much smaller and would not normally be able to access this kind of resourcing. But at the same time, the bigger organization has the capacity, has the infrastructure, has the technology to be able to walk a journey together with the smaller organizations. And so some of those sort of new, fresh perspectives on how people could actually structure some of their partnerships when it comes to funding they've been very interesting discussions, and I'm excited to see where they go, to make sure that we don't just empower the big ones, and that the smaller entities that are doing incredible work don't get left behind.
And before we move on to this, Kathy has just made a comment that on the group chat that there certainly is important to collaborate, but that there's always a risk that smaller organizations may be taken advantage of. And so the critical question is, how do we protect this from happening? I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Sure. I suppose it's all about having really good governance structures, having really good due diligence and reporting measurements. I mean, that's the best that you can put in place. But if we think clearly and we actually look at the risks where the smaller organizations could be not benefiting in the way that they should be benefiting, we could actually put in metrics around that so that we can try to get some kind of view on how this relationship is being managed, how the funds are being managed, how the capacity is being managed. But I think we don't want to let go of some of the things that we've always done, things like site visits, things like going and actually meeting with the smaller organizations and trying to understand how it's going, so that we can tweak the model. It's something that's going to be very new and different. So I think it's going to be very much a conversation that we will learn as we go and continuously tweak en route.
Thanks, Keri. I'm conscious of time. We've only got 10 minutes left before we open it up for Q&A. So my last question to the panelists, and this one, you know, for Louise, Mamo, and I'm sure, Nox, you've also got a perspective on this as well, is, you know, and you've all touched on this at some point of talking about trust, you know, talking about how do we support smaller organizations, particularly those that are closer to the issues. But it all speaks to kind of strong governance, financial management, the importance of having reserves. You know, my goodness, having reserves has come up as such a critical issue, you know, for as COVID has happened. So my final question is, you know, what is your perspective on how you think funders may start to, if at all, might start looking at this through a different lens? So instead of just saying this must be in place, do you expect that they might be, given how they have responded and recognizing that they need to help build stronger organizations or support that, what do you think, how do you think attitudes or policies might change to help or encourage not-for-profit organizations to work to strengthening? Mamo, I wonder if you can start off the responses from the panelists.
Thanks, Sarah. I think the issue of sustainability, I think it's been said a few times here that it's something that has been a conversation for the sector for many, many years. And I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us is that we probably need to support civil society organizations and nonprofits to start adopting a variety of models that can help them become a lot more sustainable. And that takes, I think, from the side of foundations, being a lot more flexible in how you resource organizations. And I think I'll always go back to kind of the power of providing flexible support, which in many of the foundations we call general purpose support. Because what that does is that it gives civil society organizations the flexibility to innovate, to test new things, to take risks, to explore areas that they would not have been able to explore if they were restricted to using donor money for very specific projects. And so I think how we structure our funding as foundations has a huge bearing on what nonprofits are able to do, how they think. You know, there's been a number of foundations that have not been very comfortable, for example, in giving support for things like endowment funds. You know, and that you know has been very limiting in many instances for organizations, because it meant that even when they were able to build reserves, they could not use those reserves to kind of invest in their long-term existence. So kind of thinking more differently about how we engage with nonprofits around how our funding models is going to be important going forward. But on the question of governance, I mean, as foundations, you know, when you engage with any civil society organization, those are the first things that you look at. Those are the kind of the tick box things that you will always look for in as far as funding is concerned. But I think, as you say, you know, having seen how much of what happens on the ground has become needed in this period, it will probably be important for foundations to start perhaps supporting their partners to think differently about how they even structure their governance. You know, for instance, you find organizations now that are much more about including the communities that they work within in their governance structures. And that's, I think for me, that's an important element, because then it means that the voices of the people that are ultimately affected by these issues are represented in some of the decisions within the bigger organizations. And I think it goes back to the issues, the question that came up earlier about how we make sure that the smaller ones and the communities that are supported are protected in these processes. And so I think there's probably an opportunity there, you know, without imposing as foundations, because that's an important part, but engaging with partners differently so that we kind of encourage them to start finding different models of governing such that it's inclusive. So I think there's an opportunity there that COVID-19 has presented in many ways for us.
Thanks, Mamo. Louise, do you think other funders within IPASA would share that perspective, that Mamo, and what's your...
Yeah, Sarah, if you don't mind, I just want to quickly respond, before I answer that question, I just want to respond to what Knox and Keri were talking about earlier, because I think it's a very important issue to raise, which should have raised when you asked me the earlier question. And that was about the power of collaboration and how, if ever, people have recognized now that the problems that we are experiencing at the moment are too huge for one funder to solve. And this is what we've really seen, is that funders have put aside their own agendas and have come together to collaborate on issues, collaborate in terms of funding, collaborate in terms of trying to find solutions, collaborate in terms of advocacy, which is I think, incredibly important at the moment, because the one partner we have struggled with and not managed with at the moment is government. So there needs to be funder collaboration for advocacy with the government to try and shift things. And on the small non-profit side, what I wanted to say is that what funders are looking at now is collectives who are addressing a certain issue which goes across all sectors. I'll give you an example. Psychosocial support in education is a huge issue at the moment. There's the Mental Wellness Initiative, which is bringing a whole lot of small non-profit organizations working on the ground in psychosocial support. And they play an intermediary role for funders to fund through these initiatives into these smaller organizations. Also, the intermediary funders also play an amazing role because they get funding into these small, rural, lesser known organizations. So I just want to make that point that collaboration is key, and that not just collaboration on the funder side, but collaboration on the non-profit side is what funders are looking at. Solutions which cut across, no longer they're saying we're only investing in education, we're only investing in environment. They're recognizing that, you know, that these issues we're facing at the moment, whether it be gender-based violence or psychosocial or food security, cut across all the sectors. So, sorry, I just wanted to...
No, thank you.
Very succinctly, because I know I've only got a minute, on the on investing in organizations going into the future, I think it's really important, and I touched on it earlier, was organizational development. So that funders are now looking at how they can develop the organization, particularly in terms of if there's a crisis, how does that organization handle going forward in terms of financial sustainability. And so funders are looking at investing in the organization itself and not just the programs it develops. Very important thing which has been highlighted is the leadership development. You don't have a strong leader in times of crisis, what is going to happen to that organization. And then mentoring in terms of the skills that these funders have in terms of their operational team that can be that can be passed on to the beneficiaries, to the staff at the beneficiaries. And then also helping with training and things like M&E, financial processes and systems. So not just investing in the outcomes of their projects, but actually in the organization itself to try sustain it and build it in strength.
Well, we are just over our allocated time, and so we do need to wrap it up now. Just a huge thanks to all our panelists, to Louise, to Knox, to Keri-Leigh, and to Mamo for joining us today, for giving up your time, for sharing so generously. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I'm thrilled that this is being recorded because I think it's one of those discussions that is going to be, you want to go back to and listen to this again. There's been some incredibly valuable insights, and I thank you all so much for being part of this Think Good session. Thank you to Jacques for supporting us on the tech side. Jacques is from Inyatelo. And thank you to everyone who's joined us on this for the session today. And thank you for everything that you're doing. And I trust that this will be really valuable. The takeaways that you take out from this are that you're really able to reflect on them and to look and to think about doing things differently. So yeah, certainly towards a new horizon as the theme for this year is. So I hope you enjoy the rest of today's sessions, and thank you again for your time. Thanks everybody.